Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of our CSEC lecture series. My name is Alexis McDavid. I am an outreach officer at the Institute of Jamaica, and the division I am at is the National Museum Jamaica division, and we are an agency of the Ministry of Culture for those who may not have heard of the Institute of Jamaica. This lecture series is a collaborative effort between the Institute of Jamaica and the Department of History and Archaeology. And we just want to thank you all again for tuning in and participating. And I just want to thank our presenter now, Karl Watts, for joining us today. Karl Watts is a lecturer here at UWI campus, and his research interests include economics and business history, sports history, and landscape history. And he will be talking about theme 6 on the syllabus, which is Caribbean economy, 1875 to 1985. And the topic is Cuba's sugar industry since emancipation. Thank you so much, Karl, for joining us today. Again, really appreciate it. And to kick things off, the first question, what was Cuba like before its sugar revolution?
Cuba was primarily a pastoral economy, and it's where they focused primarily on domestic agriculture, livestock rearing, and other and miscellaneous activities related to the domestic economy. This did not translate to a plantation model style of sugar production, although they did produce sugar from the 16th century and so on. It did not translate to the plantation style economy that was the case in Barbados or Jamaica or Saint Domingue before it became Haiti. Right, so it was primarily a pastoral economy.
So how did Cuba become the world's leading sugarcane producer?
The early period of Cuban sugar production on a large scale began in 1790, and the period ran until about 1820. This is considered the first major stage when they began acquiring slaves in significant numbers, and their sugar production increased to around 55,000 tons by 1820. This is when they also improved land transactions so that land could be easily acquired through sale, lease, or various other means. And this allowed them to accumulate, or the emerging bourgeoisie, or Cuban bourgeoisie, the native bourgeoisie, to accumulate landed resources that was crucial to the start of the sugar revolution. This carried on. Cuba became a very established slave society in the 20th century. By the time of 1860, they became the premier slave sugar, let's say the late 1860s, they became the premier cane sugar producer in the world. The main issue here is that there was a brief lull, a brief break in all this activity. Hence why we started the period after 1880 in Emancipation, because for 1868 to 1878, they fought what was known as the 10 Years' War. After this war for independence, although unsuccessful, it did lead to the emancipation of the slaves by 1880, and they then fulfilled the apprenticeship period, which ended, abruptly, not abruptly, but ended earlier than expected in 1886.
So how did Cuba's sugar industry expand after 1880, during emancipation, full emancipation in like 1886?
All right, so after 1886, after full emancipation, but this process it began in 1880, hence the title of this presentation. But after 1880, Cuba was able to adjust to the demands of a free labor market. This free labor market required the payment of wages to workers and so on, and it meant that there was no longer property in slaves or property in human flesh. Some territories that underwent sugar revolutions, such as Jamaica, were unable to adjust to the demands of emancipation or the introduction of wage labor. Cuba had no such qualms after 1880, because they found ways to adapt. The sugar industry was holistic. It was a very all-encompassing industry within the island. And the former slaves, or the emancipated slaves, they continued to work on these estates along with Chinese indentured workers, etc., up to a point. And this allowed the sugar industry to continue to grow and to expand, especially with the innovations in technology. The old mills were replaced by steam-powered mills at one point, and this allowed Cuba to expand to a point where they could produce by 1894 up to nearly 1 million tons. And 1894 is a watershed period because the sugar industry was dramatically affected by the Second Cuban War of Independence, which took place in 1895. The sugar production fell, but then it rebounded after the war, obviously. Independence was achieved in 1901. So by 1901, the United States became heavily involved in the production of sugar. So a quick word on the role played by the United States. They did not own the productive capital in Cuba prior to the Second War of Independence in 1895. What occurred was that they had a commercial hold on Cuba, and this took several forms. So for instance, there was the Sugar Act of 1871 that was passed in the US, and it was the first legislative tool, according to Moreno Fraginals, or Manuel Moreno Fraginals. It was the first legislative tool of neo-colonial domination under pressure of the East Coast refiners for the specific purpose of economically dominating Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Santo Domingo. So there was also a Reciprocity Treaty of 1884 that was signed between the US and Spain. It was signed by Spain because at the time Cuba was still a colony of Spain. So this was on behalf of Cuba and Puerto Rico, who were colonies of Spain, and this was to ensure the reciprocal duties on exports and imports from the respective territories. So what we see is that from the 19th century, the United States had a significant commercial influence on the Cuban market for sugar. Why is this important? Before beet sugar, Cuba was able to export freely to countries such as Britain, but after the introduction of beet sugar, Cuba had to find alternative markets, and the US presented the best proposition because Spain could not absorb all of the sugar that Cuba was producing. Hence why they turned to the United States, which was a very Hence why they turned to the United States, which was an expanding market for sugar exports, not only for the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, but also in the British Caribbean. So Cuba took advantage of this, and it was at the time one of the largest producers of cane sugar in the world. Right, so after independence, one major positive by 1898, however, one thing that needs to be borne in mind is that 93.5% of the sugar mills belonged to Cuban and Spanish capital, and only 6.5% belonged to foreigners, including US citizens. This would radically be overturned following the Cuban War. This would radically be overturned following the Spanish-American War, or if you prefer, the Cuban War of Independence, which ended in 1898. After 1898, and when Cuba achieved independence in 1901, the sugar industry, large portions of it fell into the hands of US capital. US capital gradually and also radically expanded the hold of US capital on the Cuban economy. There was also there was a Reciprocity Treaty of 1903, which reinforced these ties reinforced the economic ties between the US and Cuba as an independent nation. Cuba achieved independence 1901. By 1902, the Platt Amendment and the Reciprocity Treaty were significant features of the Cuban political economy, or the Cuban governance structure, based on their international relations with the United States. Cuba continued to produce at a high level after the Reciprocity Treaty, with the US as a guaranteed market and the US as a guaranteed investor in expanding the sugar enterprise in the island. This enterprise reached a point where Cuba became the largest cane sugar producer in the world, accounting for 1/5 of all sugar production in the world. So by 1925, Cuba, under the direction of US capital, which expanded significantly in the eastern section of the island, was able to produce by 1925 as much as 5 million tons. In 1920, they earned a whopping $1 billion from the export of sugar. So by 1925, they reached a point where they were, or by the 1920s, they reached a point where they were producing up to 5 million tons of sugar, which represented a significant expansion of production from the days of 1880, or when the territory just became emancipated. U.S. investment in infrastructure such as railroads and ports and so on supported this massive expansion of Cuban sugar production. But this came crashing down, not dramatically, but it came down to an extent, or it was unable to expand even further as a result of the Great Economic Depression of 1929. By 1930, in response to the Great Depression, and a means to secure their own market for sugar and their territories such as Puerto Rico and Hawaii, which were also sugar producers as well, the United States passed tariff acts which restricted access. So Cuba could only send a quota or a portion of their sugar to the United States market. So this restricted market and shrinking prices, obviously during the 1930s, the Great Depression years, this forced Cuba to adjust, and they could only produce at a certain level. They still produce sugar, but they only could have produced at a certain level. And they were unable to expand their sugar industry to a magnificent point. It is speculated that they could have produced at an even higher level had they had access to certain markets. This became apparent after the revolution in 1959, and Cuba eventually became fully communist in 1963. So this allowed Cuba to secure a very large market in the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries, which obviously were affiliated with Cuba along ideological lines and so on in terms of communism. This allowed Cuba the means to expand their sugar production to a significant point. Obviously, Cuba, right immediately after the revolution, Cuba attempted to diversify its economy by not being so reliant on sugar. But eventually, they had to revert back to sugar because it was their best in terms of specialization and in terms of earning much needed foreign exchange. So their attempts at economic diversification away from sugar was not successful for the period 1959 to 1963. But they were able to secure the market of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union supported them to the point where they felt confident to produce up to 10 million tons of sugar by 1970. This target they did not meet. They produced only 8.5, but it was still a magnificent achievement for a Caribbean nation. After the 1970s and under the Soviet Union, Cuban sugar expanded even on a more consistent and a more reliable basis, in the sense that Cuban sugar was allowed the opportunity to produce and expand without the pressures of performance or the demand to make foreign exchange, in a certain sense, because of the guaranteed support of the Soviet Union and their favorable prices that they would guarantee the Cubans from 1973 up until the 1980s. This allowed Cuba to produce on average 7.6 million tons of sugar after 1979, or for the period of the 1980s. So the support of the United States came to a halt from as early as the 1930s as a result of the Great Depression, but with the support of the Soviet Union after 1959, Cuba was able to expand even further its average annual production by the 1980s, and allowed Cuba to invest even further in machinery that would allow them to more efficiently produce sugar.
You just went through the role that the US and the Soviet Union played in supporting Cuba's sugar industry. So what lessons can Caribbean people learn from the growth of Cuba's sugar industry?
Okay, the Caribbean historically has long been associated with sugar from the days, or the production of sugar from the 17th century. Yes, we did produce in the 15th century, but in terms of the plantation style of production, or the plantation economic style of production, the Caribbean has long been associated with the production of sugar on a large scale historically, since Barbados led its first revolution in the 1640s. This revolution continued and spread to territories such as Jamaica and Saint Domingue, which eventually became Haiti, who were known as the leading producers of sugar for the 18th century. So Cuba remained, since the 19th century, one of the world's major sugar producers for nearly 200 years, as in international producers. So while its economy was not as large or as grand as a sugar producer, Cuba was considered a giant and a world leader in sugar production, a position that was once held by Jamaica and Saint Domingue in the 18th century. The lessons we can take from this is that in terms of specialization and in the areas of free trade and so on, the fact that Cuba was able to produce at such a high level and to reduce the cost of production to a point that allowed it to be so competitive on the world was a lesson for other territories that were unable to adjust to the growing demands of the world market, especially with the advent of beet sugar. Cuba carried the torch very well, but this was facilitated obviously by the support of great powers such as the United States and the Soviet Union. Whereas other territories fell by the wayside in terms of sugar production, or they had to diversify their product, Cuba was able to maintain this high level of production, monocultural production of sugar, which allowed it to stay afloat as a major Caribbean economy, even though other activities, obviously, such as tourism, urbanization, the expansion of government, that allowed Cuba as an independent nation to thrive. But sugar remained for such an extensive period its primary foreign exchange earner. All right, so this allowed Cuba for several centuries to continue flying the torch for the Caribbean from the days of the 17th century as one of the world's leading sugar producers. Obviously, in the 1990s, this went down and Cuba lost that reputation, and with it, the Caribbean. So Cuba, in terms of studying the last thing to say or to note is that in the study of sugar production in the Caribbean, or its historical value in terms of the appreciation of the extent that the Caribbean could produce sugar on a large scale, one has to bear in mind the significant advances made by Cuba during the 19th and obviously the 20th century.
So Karl, do you have any final thoughts about the theme that we're exploring today?
Okay, all right. This theme, the Caribbean society, Caribbean economy and so on, since 1875 to 1885, that covers obviously a century. What we can take from this theme generally is that the Caribbean has made strides, or did in this period from 1875 to 1885, the Caribbean made significant strides in diversifying itself in terms of or diversifying the economy away from sugar, which was the dominant dominant commodity that was produced in the, or the, sorry, which was, so this, so the Caribbean territories for the period 1875 to 1885 made significant strides in diversifying their economies, where they no longer became so reliant on sugar production. They moved into other areas such as industrialization. This is the case of the Dutch Antilles or the Netherlands Antilles, the ABC Islands in particular, which turned to oil refining in the 1930s. There's a case of mining in the likes of Suriname, Jamaica, the petroleum industry, which took off in Trinidad. And also even in the sphere of agriculture, other territories are able to diversify. So for instance, Jamaica became a prominent banana producer. Trinidad became proficient in producing cocoas. And there were other territories, even though sugar was still a major crop, the other territories had to find new markets to keep afloat. So for instance, the British Caribbean had to become ever more reliant on the Canadian market for sugar and so on. But regardless of all this and the development of manufacturing took off in the likes of Cuba, territories such as Cuba, Trinidad, Jamaica, even though it's hard to believe that Jamaica had such a prominent manufacturing industry, but we still have legacies of that to this day in terms of our food and beverage sector, for instance, that is still prominent now in our current society, in the Jamaican society, that is. So for this period, 1875 to 1985, there was a significant move away from sugar as a dominant or the major crop or the major product that would have come out of the Caribbean. And obviously, forgive me for not mentioning tourism. Tourism has largely, in most Caribbean territories, including Cuba since the 1990s, tourism has largely replaced, in most Caribbean territories. And this began earlier in territories like the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Cuba always had tourism, but it wasn't as dominant as sugar up until the 1990s. But tourism eventually, or has become, and other services that Caribbean territories normally offer, have become the dominant foreign exchange earner in the Caribbean. This is a process that began from the 1930s, with the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Cuba, and then expanded to the point where all territories, or most territories, engage in some form of tourism as a major foreign exchange earner. And like I said, there were other forms of diversification within the agricultural sector and outside of it in the form of industrialization, and those other activities. Urbanization became prominent in the Caribbean after 1945, whereas before 1945, for instance, Havana would have been one of the largest cities. Even though after 1945, there were several large cities with several hundred thousands of individuals. This was not the case before 1945. So eventually the Caribbean has radically expanded its economy in a certain sense, and it is no longer associated as it was during slavery and at some point under colonialism with the production of primarily sugar. But Cuba, we can take lessons from Cuba in the fact that they continue to produce sugar at a very high level, even up until 1985, when compared with other territories that moved beyond sugar at some point in time, when they realized that they were no longer competitive on the international market. So Cuba still remained competitive for various reasons, until the 1990s when the Soviet Union fell.
All right, well, thank you so much. I just want to, again, thank everyone for tuning in today. We can't thank you enough, Karl Watts, for coming in and participating on this Zoom lecture. And just to tell everyone, please subscribe and follow us on our social media platforms. The University of the West Indies Department of History and Archaeology, National Museum Jamaica, the Institute of Jamaica. As I said, subscribe and follow, and tune in for our next episode, which should be released shortly. All right, thank you. And thanks again, Karl.